Welcome to our conversations on Old Western culture, the rise of England. I'm Wes Callahan, and I'm here with Peter Leithart, talking about the period from the mid 16th century to the mid 17th century, roughly. And Peter, we're talking about Shakespeare today, and one of the things that we want to consider is a controversy that I think probably only arose recently, maybe in the 19th century, about the authorship of Shakespeare. What can you tell us about the controversy? What is the question at issue?
Yeah, the question, and you're right that it did arise just in the last century and a half or so, as a major issue in Shakespeare studies. It's kind of a marginal issue for the mainstream of Shakespearean scholarship. Most recognized Shakespeare scholars take a traditional view that William Shakespeare, who was an actor, part of acting troops in London, resident of Stratford, a burgher of Stratford, property owner in Stratford, litigious citizen of Stratford, that he wrote the plays. That's the traditional view, and that's the view that most Shakespeare scholars still hold to today. But over the past century and a half or so, there's actually it goes back to the early 19th century. There's been a series of alternatives suggested that it wasn't William Shakespeare that wrote the plays, but some other character, some other person who wrote the plays. And various explanations are given for saying that William Shakespeare the plays were attributed to him. He's kind of serving as a front man. Sometimes the idea is that it was some nobleman who it would be scandalous for him to be involved in the theater. And so he found an actor who was already scandalous, so it didn't matter, and got his name, put his name on the plays that were actually being written by somebody else. Sometimes the theory is that there's somebody who's very much entwined, embedded in the court, and that the plays are kind of coded commentary on current events. But the author of the plays can't let on that that's what he's doing, and so he has to distance himself from the plays. If his own name appeared on the plays, then he would have to distance himself. Then they would know, we know who he's talking about. We know who this character is, and this character is, and this character is, and off with his head.
Okay.
So he's protecting himself and avoiding court scandal by finding a front man for his own plays. But go ahead.
So what are the sorts of things that drive people to these sorts of theories? What kinds of things are they looking at to make them think it must have been somebody else?
Yeah, I think there's several things. There is a question about Shakespeare's education. He's there's obviously he's a literary genius, but there are also indications that he was fairly well read. It's hard to tell from the plays exactly how well read in Plutarch and some classical literature. He knows English history to some extent. He knows at least a smattering of French, enough to write a few scenes in French, and a little bit of Latin. He tried to piece together what kind of education would produce these plays. And the problem is we don't know much at all about Shakespeare's education. We know that he wasn't a university-educated man, but what kind of education did he receive? What kind of formal education, if any, did he receive in Stratford as a boy? We can't really tell. There was a school in Stratford called the King's School. I don't believe that it's certain that Shakespeare attended the King's School, but if he did, what kind of education did he get? It's hard to piece together those kind of questions. So part of it is the education. Does the educational, what we know about Shakespeare's education fit with the knowledge that the writer of the plays obviously had? I think really what drives a lot of it is a conception of what a poet is and what kind of character a poet is. And this goes to the point that I made earlier, that it's a fairly recent development that people look for alternatives, and it comes in conjunction with the rise of Romanticism in English poetry, which has among other things, has a new vision of what a poet is supposed to be. A poet is kind of an almost prophetic figure, inspired by some power beyond some supernatural power. And there's there's an expectation that the poet will have a certain live a certain kind of life, flamboyant and free and bucking the trends of normal society, which is not Shakespeare. What we know about William Shakespeare is very prosaic. He's I wasn't joking when I said he was a litigious citizen of Stratford. A lot of what we know about Shakespeare's life in Stratford comes from court records. Some of them property deals. He bought a lot of property in Stratford, but also going to court against other citizens of Stratford.
So how would the earlier vision of what a poet is, or someone who shared that vision, how would they respond to this later vision that says he's got to be this flamboyant person inspired by the muse and so on?
Yeah. Well, I think that in earlier, very, centuries earlier, and you have, you look at the visual statuary architectural arts of the Middle Ages, most of which is, the art is anonymous, and the artists are not expected to have any kind of particular life. They're good at something, they're craftsmen. They're capable of sculpting stone or manipulating paint to create beautiful, or stained glass, producing stained glass that makes a beautiful window in the cathedral. So I think that's the earlier vision, and it seems to me that you're probably going through some kind of transition when you get to the early modern English period, and more of the later notion of the nature of the poet is probably present there. But you still have this kind of craft idea, I think, that a poet is somebody who's good with words, and that's it's a gift of God, but it's not seen as having these kind of countercultural connotations that it has later.
So who are some of the people that have been named in more recent discussions about alternative authorship?
Yeah, the most popular one these days is Edward de Vere, who was the Earl of Oxford at the time that Shakespeare was alive. And again, the arguments have to do with, part of the arguments have to do with chronology and when the plays were written and whether Shakespeare was in the right place at the right time when things were happening. Part of it has to do with his educational level. De Vere is the one where the motivation for presenting the plays as the plays of someone else has to do with De Vere's presence in the court. So, and this is one of the things that I find a little off-putting by the debate. I think it's a fascinating debate, largely as a mirror of changing conceptions of poetry and literature. But one of the things that's off-putting about it is the way that Oxfordians, people who advocate the Earl of Oxford as the author, tend to read the plays as coded coded commentary on what's going on in the court. And I have no doubt that Shakespeare had contemporary characters and events in mind as he wrote things, but it seems a reduction of the plays to turn them into that kind of punditry, which can happen. Because you start looking at the plays not as great works of literature, but as evidence for the authorship.
Yeah, codes to be deciphered.
Right.
Yeah, and the putting Oxford forth as an author, that was more in the 20th century.
That was, yes.
Who,
right.
Who was before him?
Francis Bacon was an option prior to that. I don't mean to prejudice the case, but the most complete early defense of the Oxfordian theory was a book published by Thomas Looney, a schoolteacher. So I think it's quite proper to call that the Looney theory of the authorship of Shakespeare's plays.
Are there well-known people who've backed the Oxford theory?
Yeah, Joe Sobran, conservative, mainly political writer, wrote a book defending the Oxfordian theory. I think Sobran's died not a number of years ago, but in the latter part of his life, he wrote what became one of the most popular books on that was defending that theory.
I've heard that there are some other fairly famous literary figures like Mark Twain. Was it Eliot? Was he one of
the plays were attributed to Twain?
No. I'm sorry. That the plays who thought that the plays were attributed to somebody other than Shakespeare.
Right.
Another person by the same name.
Yes, yeah. There were was a group of American writers. Hawthorne was among them,
Hmm.
and they were convinced by a woman named Delia Bacon, who claimed to be related to Francis Bacon. I'm not sure that lineage was ever established, but she claimed to be related to Francis Bacon. Um, was She convinced a number of American writers that Bacon had written the plays, but they all became suspicious of her sanity at
Yeah,
certain points.
yeah.
I have a vague recollection of stories about uh, expeditions to break into the crypt in the Trinity Church in Stratford to find out whose bones were actually inside. Delia Bacon, I think she was also the one who was able to establish the authorship of the plays through consulting spirits. You went to,
All
or
right, so
you go to a medium and they can,
yeah.
the spirits will spill the beans. The whole story comes out.
So some questions about her sanity, but at least the bacon theory is tasty.
But not loony.